This is St. Pete X, affectionately known as SPX. SPX brings you St. Pete's brightest business people, civic leaders, and citizens who share their insight and expertise as well as their love of our great city. SPX is presented by the St. Petersburg Group. Head to stpete.co to check out more episodes, and by St. Pete's most effective marketing agency, Big C. Browse to bigc.co to see their work. Now enjoy the conversation. Joining me on SPX today is local publishing magnate, Peter Schorsch. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me. It's an impressive operation for all those that are listening here. It's very cool being here.
Thank you. I want to start by telling the story the first time you entered my consciousness, which was Senator Latvala was speaking at the Kate Tiedemann School of Business, and it was one of the chamber's coffee chat sessions. And, it started, I think, at 8 or 8:30 in the morning, and there was a little bit of networking, and then he started talking. And, about 10 minutes in, someone had walked in and sat down, and he just kept rolling. It was non-issue. And then maybe 20 minutes in, someone else came in and went and sat down. And then about 40 minutes in, someone else came in and he stopped dead in his tracks. And, and he just sort of was gathering his thoughts. And then he goes, well, I'm glad I talked about all the important stuff, the secret stuff already. I forget exactly what he said. And this person walked up to the fourth tier and sat down. And he sort of started, Senator Latvala talked a little bit more, and he kind of stumbled again. He goes, well, I guess this is, I don't know. And this person raised his hand and said, don't worry, keep going off the record. And then he finished talking. There's a Q&A, and he sort of had to cut the Q&A short because he had to go. So there was a time pressure. And as he walked out, he stopped by the door, turned around, walked up to the very fourth tier to shake this person's hand, which was you, of course. And I leaned over to the next to me. I'm like, who is this guy? He's just, is he ruling the room? So I thought that was noteworthy. And then I started looking into some of the stuff that you did. And I will say that a lot of that ultimately started me down the path, which led to the St. Pete Catalyst. I think seeing you and what you did to fill the political vacuum, I hope to do it on the business side of things. But yeah, so for just us meeting for the first time today, we'll say you've had a pretty big impact on my existence.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. It was certainly noteworthy because anytime you can get Jack Latvala to go up 4 flights of steps is significant. Jack. But I do remember that. And I wish it was for a politician. No offense to the former senator. I wish it was for somebody that was still in the game. But no, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and I don't understand why more reporters / journalists don't do this, but it's not just get out and talk to the people, but get to chamber and business related events. Like, I'm amazed that there wasn't another reporter in there, right? I mean, here's Jack Latvala, at that time, the most important state senator, and he's going to give a public briefing
with Q&A.
Yeah. Like, why aren't you there? Like, that to me is chum in the water.
And I think that's part of the reason why you're successful is because you recognize the value of that where others, didn't and had more of a going through the motions sort of thing. And that was the opportunity for you to get exactly the words out of his head and the opinions out of his head that you wanted, custom made.
I'm sure you know Bill Carlson over at Tucker Hall.
Sure.
What he's done with that.
Cafe Con Tampa.
Yeah, I mean, where you're getting this great news story. And I'm surprised every Friday that there isn't 4 cameras in the back and 2 reporters because it's always newsworthy. It's interesting. And there's, another 100 people around there that are interesting and you can get their feedback from. And so I'm a little surprised that you don't see more of that. And so that's something, yes. And I do wear shorts and I do kind of come in semi-casual. It's not because I don't care. I mean, we should talk about it. I've got the best tailor in the world, this guy, Aaron Gober. I say he's the best because he cuts for the Southern gentleman, which means he makes his suits a little bit more generous. And so my belly doesn't pour out. And so I love him for it. But I call it going commando, and not the real version of going commando, but getting out into these community events and just showing up. Yes, you can go do a press conference, but I think there's so many interesting, intriguing places to go find news and stories. And I think you're right. And I commend you for it. Like, the business community in St. Petersburg has really been underreported. There's been some great business columnists at the Tampa Bay Times. Trejo, Harrington are both solid reporters, but it's like, quite honestly, I've always been surprised at the disconnect between the chamber and some of the other incubators and the media world. And that's changed a little bit, but it's like, my good friend is Greg Holden, who was the former chair 2 years ago. And I was always surprised that the Tampa Bay Times didn't call him basically every day for a quote on whatever the big development was. And I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing, because it's like, the chamber would call me up and say, hey, Steve Westfall's opening a new restaurant. And it's like, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I can do it a little bit, but it's not really a political story. But the Times would look at it like it was kind of maybe too small for the general audience. But I'm like, no, this is important business news. This is the news. And again, they do as critical as I am sometimes at the Times, they're pound for pound, probably the best newspaper in the country. But I think that there was definitely a void that you all are filling.
I came at it from the business side. So I'm sitting on, grow smarter committees and chamber committees and EDC committees, and all these people are putting time into putting these efforts out there, and they just end up being sort of whispers in the community because it's the same few people they're talking to over and over. And so this whole, the revelation of this vacuum came from sitting in this situation, feeling the frustration that Steinecker faces and JP at the EDC faces, and seeing them knocking up against sort of the brick wall of, hey, we want some attention here for this good stuff, and there just wasn't a vehicle to do it. Case in point, they're coming to you about politics, try to get you to talk about a restaurant, right? So, yeah, that's very true, and I do think the disconnect, it wasn't from a lack of trying in the business community.
No, I think and we talked a second about them, but I do think the Business Journal does a good job.
They do, yeah.
I'm not 1,000% sure what their business model is. I think they've got some strength because they're leveraged into other cities. They hired Janelle Irwin, who had worked for us. I think they do a very good job. They're Tampa centric. They're very Jeff Innick centric, which is, he's the straw that's stirring the drink over there right now. I wish there was more St. Pete focus. I liked when Eric Snyder, I don't remember where he was at, but, he would write about some of the smaller restaurants and opening. Like, I'm surprised, and this is the beauty of podcasts, especially with me. We're going to go into some tangents, but Laura Riley, who is the food critic for the Times, she's probably one of the best food critics in the country. She was a finalist for a Pulitzer, I think the year before last. She doesn't have the New York market to write about, but she does a really good job with our 2-star food market here. One of the things that surprised me, and I used to talk to Laura all the time, she got rid of her blog. She got rid of her food blog. Her food blog would have, hey, Noble Pizza's opening here. Or we talked to Chef Jeremy about what they're doing at Cassis or what have you. And a lot of it didn't make it into the newspaper. And her argument was, they're paying me to write for the newspaper. So I'm going to just write my items for the newspaper. Why am I going to add another 40,000 words a month when they're not paying me for it? And she wasn't being selfish. It's a good question that a lot of journalists are having to face right now. But I think we're missing that also. I'm not looking for some sellout, everything is awesome food blog, but I am looking for a great restaurant and dining. And in other big cities, they have like 15 of those. And somehow, again, the Tampa Bay market doesn't have that. So I think there is a huge space in new media that, listen, I don't think you're going to be the only one in this market in 18 months. I think as the business community becomes more and more exciting, I think you'll get a second and a third voice in there. And then you'll see some other sites start to pop up.
And I think the key there is, and this is the same reason I think the Times doesn't do it, is the economics of attention right now. And attention is so scattered that it's hard to get enough, because the people that 10 years ago liked food, but they're also into left-handed butterflies and are now on some forum spending their time learning about left-handed butterflies and not learning about food, which they may have because they have an interest in it, but just not as much of an interest as the really, really specific and cool stuff that they're into. And so we end up in a space where, the attention is, you do that, and it's not so much even the money, but if you felt like you were doing the 40,000 words and 1,000 people were reading it, or 10,000 or whatever the number needs to be, that's one thing. But you do that, and because of the nature of even people knowing it exists or taking the time to do it, then you're getting 50 readers, and that's daunting.
I remember when my site was so small,
Yeah,
I could see the individual IP addresses logging on to
right.
it, and I would watch. And I'm like, hey, you're there. And you're like, why are you writing that? And I think it takes about 18 months for a local site.
With hard work.
With hard work, unless you have some major investor that you're going to be able to hire 20 reporters and go at it. But if you're building from scratch, I think it takes about 18 months to get it even in a position to be break even. But I think that, and I think this is an advantage, we have a lucrative targeted audience, lawyers, lobbyists, politicians. We know that that's where money is going to be. The people that are writing a left-handed whatever, we don't necessarily know where they're going to be. But I will say this, the people that are making these business decisions are not necessarily the best people to be making these business decisions. Case in point is Paul Tash. And this is where I am critical of the Times. Paul Tash, I think, is a great newspaper man, but that's what he is a newspaper man. And so he thought it was ideal 12 years ago to spend $21 million on the naming rights for a stadium.
Mm.
And that's really what put the Times into the debt that it found itself. Is like, well, they were the only newspaper in the country at that point to have that kind of deal. And they thought the industry was going to continue to grow and that that would turn into something more than it did. And it clearly did not. And so they've had to sell their building and all of the financial issues that they have had. And my point is I'm surprised that there aren't more tech savvy people leading newspaper companies. And so, like, you see, like, a national company like Tronc. For people that don't know, that's the old line of Tribune newspapers, like the Chicago Tribune. And in Florida, it's like the Sun Sentinel and the Orlando Sentinel. And they ridiculously changed their name from the Tribune Publishing Company or whatever to Tronc. And it was so bad that they may go back to it. And I see it throughout the industry. You see people that were in the newspaper business making business decisions for basically a 21st century media company, which is completely different than what it was.
Is there anybody doing it right? I mean, can you point to a paper? Because I don't know if maybe it's not the medium, right? Because even the Times is, starting to sit on top of each other because they're giving up office space to save money on rent. And, if anybody should be able to monetize their content, it's them. And then you look at the flip side of that, where maybe the future of this sort of model is you need a Bezos behind you, like the Post, to be viable. And then Bezos gets, the follow-on benefit to his other businesses.
Well, the president thinks that they're the lobbyist for the.
Sure. Yeah, that doesn't help either. But we had a couple previous shows. We've had Hank Hine in, and one of the things we talked about was why isn't art sustainable? And we had Michael Pastrician from the Florida Orchestra. So you have a thing here where there's a benefit to society, but there's a minimum threshold of asset that you have to create to make that. So for an orchestra, you need 100 musicians, you need a nice hall,
Right.
You need this sort of minimum thing. If it's just 3 guys sitting in the park, it's not the Florida Orchestra, right? But it in and of itself is not a viable financial exercise. It can't live without philanthropy. So it doesn't support itself and it relies on philanthropy. And the people who do that believe that we can invest in getting up to this minimum viable asset to give this people the experience of a Florida Orchestra. So I wonder if journalism doesn't eventually fall into that place where people can do, what I'm doing with a small team or what you're doing with a small team, but there's a minimum viable amount of team that you need to be able to do the really big stories. It's not that it's not down to a couple individuals that are doing it, but it's the relationships that they cultivate with the name behind it and the team behind it and all the resources behind it. So there's some minimum viable, resource available you have to really do the checks and balances against players on the other side of that have lots of resources to commit whatever they're committing and hope they don't get found out.
Well, I think, the newspaper business has to hit rock bottom. They have to acknowledge that it has a problem. And I don't think that that has happened yet. I mean, they will acknowledge there are financial problems, but it has nothing to do with them. I don't know why, in a lot of ways, there is a printed product anymore. Let's take a macro lesson like the Tampa Bay Times, again, to beat up on them. I hate to do that, but I don't know if you saw or not, but you basically could not read their product on a cell phone because they had the Amazon glitch. They had that for 6 or 7 months. That's like a pitcher who can't throw the ball past the mound. I mean, you have to shut down the newspaper and fix that issue. And they looked at it like it was some sort of tertiary concern. In fact, Ron Brackett the person who was charged with it is also somehow mysteriously retired here. And I wonder if the Amazon glitch may have been part of that. I think that you've got incredible technology right now. I'm looking at my iPhone right now. I think you're going to be 2 or 3 years where you won't even have the phone. It'll just be a translucent device. I think people like the tactile sensation of a newspaper. I've always wondered, somebody's going to come up with screens that are foldable and manipulatable. That's going to be perfect for a newspaper. But the idea of what they're doing, is there any uglier website than a newspaper's website? No, it's so unattractive because they are trying to jam a square peg into a round hole. They're trying to jam this printed product that goes out at 4:30 a.m. into a living, breathing organism, which is a website. And so here's the easy thing for me to say. They don't have the right people thinking about the solutions to it. Like, I think if you have a Bezos, you need 20 more Bezoses, and not just because of the money, but because he's been able to revolutionize an industry. It's the same people at Gannett that have been there for 20 years that are making the business decisions for them now. And the product has changed. No, I don't think journalism is there because one form of journalism that is working is TV. Like, TV stations didn't have the problems that newspapers did, where newspapers basically gave away their stuff for free. Then they wanted to put it back behind a paywall, which is the dumbest economic system I've ever come with. The ambiguous paywall system is so bad, is so stupid. There's so many holes. There's so many ways around it. It doesn't make sense. TV didn't have that problem. TV just became bigger and more important into our lives. They didn't give away their content for free. And so there is definitely a way to do it. It's just, I don't think the people that are making decisions for many of the newspaper companies are the right people to be doing it.
I definitely agree. I mean, in defense of the information on the internet became free. And so it was the internet that decided that written content should be free, not the internet. And there wasn't really a mechanism in the beginning
Sure.
for video to come through that. So TV still had a monopoly on video
Sure.
distribution.
You're right.
Yeah. One thing when I was talking in the intro about the Latvia incident, when I saw that, the more I thought about that from a influence in which you have a magazine called Influence, which should be mentioned too, in power standpoint, that's a positive. Are there negative sides to that sort of influence when you walk into a room and make that kind of a ripple? Can you deconstruct the emotions you feel when you hear that story back?
I want to almost answer with the quintessential job interview question, which is, well, my number one weakness is that I'm too hardworking. Yes, it sucks sometimes to be too powerful. And I will go back to the original questions and say that I try not to think about influence one way or the other, but there is a lot of negative. Number one is, especially when you connect the publishing side with the political, a lot of even my friends are uncomfortable to have me around because is what they're going to say in a private setting going to become fodder for a blog post. And so, case in point, there's a fundraiser literally this weekend. It's on a Disney cruise. We loved a Disney cruise. For anybody that follows me on Facebook, they'll know that automatically. There's a political fundraiser on there. And I was told specifically, you can't come. And I'm like, oh, okay. Not that I was going to go anyways. It usually takes a while to plan that. But it's people are going to want to come and relax. And if you're there and you're, live blogging, so-and-so having a drink at the champagne bar, they're not going to feel comfortable. So that's the number one thing. Number two, and it's kind of why I stopped writing about St. Petersburg politics. It became uncomfortable to write about subjects. And then you go down to Caldwell Coffee and you see them and they come up to you and ask, hey, are you Peter Schorsch? And you almost have to brace your face because you don't know if you're going to get punched or not.
Right.
Now, I've never been punched, but we wrote a very strong blog post critical of a local champagne bar here that opened up recently. And I'm not joking. There was a situation at our club. It was on Mother's Day where the brother of the bar owner physically accosted my wife and I because of the criticism of this champagne bar. Now, I know all this going into it. I enjoy and thrive on what I describe as, nothing less than a Beirut street fight, which is Florida politics. But it can be tough. It's tough for my wife, who was even in the process. My wife worked for Charlie Crist, was his senior advisor. And I know before we even dated that she had a lot of problems with things that I would write. And so there's a lot of uncomfortability there.
Do you make an effort to reassure your friends that off the record is off the record and that they can talk with you? Or did you just accept that what you are is a political being or a public being? And
well, go back to your story. Remember, I had to tell Senator Latvala that it's off the record.
Sure.
I would say, my very close friends, I have a rule that, if there's a drink in hand, I will say that I've kind of made it a point that a lot of my close friends aren't in politics. But it's also tough because I've lost a lot of friends. Like, the former mayor, Rick Baker, was a mentor. But we were critical of his losing mayoral campaign. Very tough. I haven't talked to Rick Baker since he lost the election. I basically lost my friend there in a lot of ways. He may not see it that way. He may just not, we may not have connected, but I know he wasn't happy with what I wrote. And I wasn't writing about Rick Baker, the person. I was writing about Rick Baker, the politician. And that was my job. In fact, I just had a client the other day say to me that his wife was upset about something that I wrote. So there is a great deal of risk and reward in that. I think like if you're Adam Smith at the Times, you just write what you write and your salary is not dependent on who you upset. In fact, the more people you upset, the better if you're a good investigative reporter. And I just don't have that luxury. You asked about my affiliations at the beginning, and I used to be more involved in the community. I was on the board of Tiger Bay. I was a board member at the chamber, but I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable for those reasons. And so if one person was uncomfortable, I felt like that was too many people. And so at this point, whether it be I had been president of the Crescent Lake Neighborhood Association, I just have come to realize that they're better off without me for a variety of reasons. And it's easier for all involved.
That's heavy. I'm starting to taste that as well with the Catalyst. And it's even weirder for me because it's a project, right? It's something the St. Petersburg group is doing as sort of an experiment. And it's not in any way ever going to be my full-time, thing, right? And so, I went in with objectivity as the guiding. In fact, the podcast that we're doing was originally going to be called Objectomy or The Objectimist, which is a weird word I made up.
I'm glad it's not that.
Thank you. Saying no is important to saying yes sometimes. But the idea was that I was going to bring on two folks and not say who they were, not say their name, and talk about an issue with the challenge of being objective. And then the hook was going to be to reveal who they were. And the idea is this is an anti-silo exercise, right? And so obviously when you go on shows and the first thing you do is shut down when you hear who they are.
Right.
But even if you figure out who they are within 15 minutes or 20 minutes, your brain has had to absorb that information in a slightly different way, a slightly more open way.
That's really smart.
And then because St. Petersburg Group is the umbrella over the Catalyst and we are about elevating St. Pete, then my mission is not necessarily truth in the traditional journalism sense. My mission is making our community smarter and better and more connected and more, appreciative and solutions-based. And so, I have the benefit of not having to write a lot of negative stuff. In fact, we don't write negative stuff. We write solutions-based things. And that doesn't mean fluff. It means solutions-based, right? And we're smart enough to kind of know the difference. And that's where I think we're not succeeding yet. I think we're writing good content, but I would like to get more into using the brain power that I have, connected to me to do that.
The challenge for you guys amongst many, and you and I talked about it before, if everybody could do this, people would be doing it. What they usually end up doing when they start a website is they write about the 5 or 6 things that they know best, and then they punch themselves out, and then they're satisfied. They got it off their chest that they didn't like the blue recycling bins, right? And then they wrote about that twice. Somebody noticed it. They wrote it on their face. But you can only write about the blue recycling bins 3 times if you're going to write a local blog. And I don't like the word blog.
Me neither.
If everything is good on the Catalyst, then nothing is bad, right? And something has to be bad for everything to be good.
I understand relativity for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I do get it. And I think, man, if you guys landed a left hook, 1 in 100, man, doesn't that strengthen the other 99?
Agreed. And I'm not saying we will never will,
Right.
but I'm saying for everything that's bad, there's a solution to make it good. And I'd rather write about that. So it's not acknowledging that there is
So wait,
bad.
if there's a bad champagne bar, you think you can actually turn that around?
If there's a bad champagne bar, I probably wouldn't write about it. Instead, I would write about a problem with the solution that's available.
Well, see, this is I love podcasts.
Sure, yeah.
This is the challenge of St. Petersburg right now. Okay, we are blessed to have people like you, right? This building wasn't here, right? Or this building wasn't like this.
Right.
There certainly wasn't Rococo across the street.
Yep.
In fact, isn't Rococo like still this hidden gem of a restaurant? I mean, it's gorgeous, incredible wine list. And I don't think 90% of the city has even had dinner yet here. What St. Petersburg right now, right at the crossroads, and we've seen this, is so we've got all these assets, but then you get douchebags that want to turn it into, how many times have you heard, oh, this place could be the new Miami Beach? And you're like, if you say that again, we are going to drop you off of the Gandy Bridge. And that's what people, like, there are law firms, big law firms. And I'm not being critical when I say this. So I want to put space between the word douchebag and when I'm talking about this. But think about the big law firm, Johnson Pope. They're set up in St. Petersburg still because they're waiting for, I think when they wrote it, they said there's so much real estate development that's going to happen, especially if the trop goes. We know there's an explosion of growth still going to go through here. Think about just around this neighborhood, between all children's, there's as many nice houses as there is houses that you and I would probably not want to live in. Think about when you have another 100 doctors here, or Johns Hopkins puts in another 100 million, how this is going to fill out, et cetera. If you look at the big debate over, and correct me on the pronunciation, but the public art at the pier, the Barbara Eckelman. Okay. Isn't that the quintessential debate happening in St. Pete? We've got this great thing, the public waterfront. We're going to have this pier. I like the Eckelman art. In fact, I just got back from Barcelona, and there's that really kind of atrocious Frank Gehry goldfish piece, which I'm sure they wondered, why the hell did somebody put a 200-foot gold medal goldfish looking thing that could be like a conquistador hat right on our beautiful beach? And now that you look at it, it's signature. And that's kind of the argument that we had here, where it's like, well, at nighttime, that art looks great. During the daytime, it looks like a cast net exploded. And it's like, I think that's the battle. And so I invite people like you to fight more on it.
That's a great example of how my philosophy would overlay that. And my philosophy would overlay that in that all the perspectives are right. They're just different perspectives. And, one thing we were talking about the other day was offshore drilling, right? So offshore drilling, the oil companies, just the rights to do that creates an asset on their books. It's a positive financial thing. It creates an asset for the government, it creates an asset for the state. The flip side of that is it introduces environmental risk. And so both of those are true. It creates an asset and it creates environmental risk. the art is good, but it also, maybe takes away some of the screen space. And so, for me, the net damage to people's openness to receiving my information is not worth giving an opinion
Hmm.
because it's arbitrary, right? It's just which perspective I happen to hold. And there's not, to me, one logical winner. And maybe there is, it's slight. And again, it's just my opinion. So I would rather have people, when they give their attention to me, it be about something that I find value in giving a solution for. So, that's, I guess, a better way to articulate it is that there has to be a worthy ROI on entering the discussion where I feel like there's a clear injustice. And if the art goes there or it doesn't go there, it'll be a slight injustice
But
to
if you
some
take
people
if the catalyst reaches the level
that it will.
that it will, people are going to want that from you, whether or not you like it or not.
Yeah. And we do this. Like one way I stepped up and I challenged the status quo was we did a series called St. Pete 2.0. And the idea is I'm sort of tired of listening to this Renaissance talk. We're on the come. We've got potential, right? And a lot of this again is from being on a lot of boards and committees and just seeing people talking about potential. And it's like we're 10 years in or 15 years in now to this potential. So what the heck lies on the other side of potential? Let's make a checklist of what do we need. So we've got great museums. I liked Ecultura, right? So we have a little South by Southwest action going on here. That's a good thing for a tier 2 city to have. We need to get some startup wins out of here, right? So I'm in the startup space. I work with a lot of startups, both in my investing and in, with Big C. And we can talk about how we're a great place for startups, but the best way to be a great place for startups is to get a few hundred, multi-$100 million companies to come out of here. And then all of a sudden we actually are getting the kind of love that we want. And so right now I'm focusing my resources in the St. Peter's group on building a new kind of incubator that will focus heavily some acumen on four.
So I should pitch you later on a couple
You can pitch me.
Oh, you can pitch all you want.
But the point is that, I'm saying to be St. Pete 2.0, we need some $100 million startups to come out of here. So I'm going to go make that happen. Or we need a voice that's uniquely ours, which is, what my attempt at the catalyst is.
I know that you have a governing philosophy here, and it's attractive and it's worthwhile. It's not that I counter. I just say, you know what? You're doing so much for the community. Don't you worry that somebody's going to come along and put in too many or the wrong condominium buildings. And then suddenly, like, we could lose this. This could be lost. We've seen it happen. And we saw it to Tampa. Remember, Tampa was the next great American city. And it took them up until last week to maybe get back to where they were supposed to be, back in the 1980s. There used to be those signs. I don't know if you've lived here all your life or not, but it was Tampa is literally the next great American city. And that never came to fruition. And I just worry that, this could all be lost. And we could so screw up the stadium deal, which we're bound to do. The stadium is a bad situation. It's a non-winnable situation. So it's just a matter of how bad does that situation get before we're all done with it. But what happens if you take out the stadium and somebody doesn't come along to redevelop it? And let me go a second level. Remember, there's also the bad, which is, I like to tell people that are new to this area, we were like one of the last cities to have a genuine race riot. Like, you get south of 13th Avenue, those people aren't part of St. Pete 2.0.
And that's ironically where I feel much more comfortable weighing in, because that's a clear injustice, right? There's nobody on the other side of that, or very few people on the other side of that, saying we don't want our kids to be educated well. So, if I'm going to fight, I'm going to fight there.
Right.
But more overarching than that is simply that, yes, I do care about those things, but I feel I can be uniquely positioned to wield an influence dictated from a brand standpoint by logic, right? And so I feel like I can be more effective in protecting against that because of maintaining
almost an integrity.
It's integrity, but it's an integrity of thinking, right?
It's an integrity of the process itself.
So it's not just about being honest. It's not just about, it's partly, it's that, but it's also thinking. I'm logic first, party second, opinion second, personality.
We don't even have mechanisms in this town in a lot of ways. That's been part of the problem as we build the pier, stop the lens, build the stadium. Where do we even have these discussions? One of the weaknesses of the chamber by definition is that there isn't anybody from west of 34th Street really involved in it. There's some businesses and everything like that. But what always turns out in these elections is everybody thinks, downtown's going to get all the money and west of the interstate is going to be, that kind of fueled Rick Kreisman's riots. I mean, he's the first mayor from the west part of town. And so I want to bring up something that you said, the tier 2 city. And I wonder, how do you get comfortable with, not you, but how do we get comfortable with that? Like, it was very hard for us when we came back from Europe. If you've been in Rome and you want to resist, like, well, over in Rome, and you're like, hey, by the way, that city's been around for 2,700 years. Okay. So Yeah, they've got statues there. So slow your roll. And so you don't want to just bring that all back. Why isn't St. Pete New Orleans? Well, because it's not. So it's like, I think another challenge that we face is like saying, this is it. Just let things be, and being kind of content with the greatness that we've got going on
Sure.
here.
Well, yeah. So, if I found things in Rome that I felt we should do here,
Mhm.
I would just do them. And then if it worked, it would work and people would get on board. I think that one of the downsides to the whole sort of what I'll call downtown board people, which is chamber boards and city boards and stuff, is just the politics and the infrastructure and the walking on eggshells a little bit. And, everybody has their interests protected and all that sort of thing. And so I think there's just sort of for me, an inefficiency to talking about things too much, and just my time is limited and I have a list of, same problem you have is resourcing, right? If I had a team of 5 people, then the things that I have coming down the pipe would get done, nicely. But right now they're just a huge
What's the
thing.
first thing you would do? Like if you were king for the day in St. Pete?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
I don't know what it is either, but I wonder, just pick your brain on that.
Yeah. I'm a student of like the beats, Kerouac and Ginsberg.
I'm
And then,
looking up there.
yeah. And, even like I think of Bob Dylan singing at a little cafe in Soho, right? And Soho has that feeling because he was there and because he became famous, but also because somebody wrote about it. They made it romantic, right? And you think about, Ginsberg reading at the City Lights bookstore out in San Francisco, or the Grateful Dead playing on their front porch and stuff. And that all happened.
Is that what the catalyst is?
It's not the catalyst. It's a general philosophy they have. So more on, we built beachdrive.com as well. So, I want to build mythology around the chefs on Beach Drive. I want Beach Drive to be a place that you go, that we set up an expectation of a feeling. This is what brand value is, right? And brand value is the most beautiful value in the world because it's completely free and it's not zero sum. It's truly a value that can be given, slightly, there's technically an expense to people if you go to one place to eat instead of another. But the idea is if people will come to St. Pete because they want to feel a certain way, because we told them Beach Drive will make them feel that way. And then they come there and we start the story and we finish the story because they met the chef and they had the food, and that's all good for everybody, right? And so to me, telling the stories of the people and showing them, in that way that brings people into the community together. So you're walking down the street, oh, there's Chef Ted from the mill or whatever. And not just chefs, obviously, there's politicians and people who are doing great things. And I'm a big fan of like Randy Russell and Karen Chaston at the foundation. When they're walking down the street, I want people to know the kind of work that they're doing.
So, and this is just, again, because it's a podcast and I have a propensity to debate. Okay, like an issue that I had, the mural gets put up on the Smith real estate building.
Mm-hmm. That's who owns this building, by the way.
But the mural that I'm talking about?
The one on 4th Street?
No, there's this Moon Underwater, then the Smith real estate building by Anata.
Yes.
And I made some public comments about it. Mine was, hey, we don't need a mural here. And people are like, oh, no, murals are great. That's what St. Pete's about. And I'm like, no, I get that. But we could use a mural on 9th Avenue and 5th Street. We don't need anything more on Beach Drive. Just using that specifically, and it's going to be the overarching theme of this podcast is that's what I'm worried about is like, oh, well, we've got the mural and now why don't we put in, like, my argument against the Champagne Bar going in, and it's an issue, I think, on a legal matter for the other landlord is we already had Trist there.
Sure.
We had a high-end bar there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we've got 2. Trist was told, and I'm not taking up the case of Trist. I was just told that Trist had something in its land use agreement. There wasn't supposed to be another high-end bar here. We don't need another Italian restaurant. We've got Bella Brava. And I fear that is endemic of everything in this town.
Sure.
Which is like when we're talking about the pier right now, how many restaurants do we need? Let me ask you a larger question. Do we even need the new pier? And I mean, the Times asked that question. Now we're going to have a pier. That seems like that's a settled issue. But nobody stopped to say, maybe we shouldn't spend $70, $80 million on a pier. We built that at a time when access to the waterfront was limited. So we needed to have something, et cetera. I guess I'm just saying I enjoy my role, which is count. I mean, you and I are diametrically different on it, where you're raising great questions and you're providing a mechanism. I think that's even more important, which is you're almost like you're rolling out the ball, which is we don't have enough of. We don't have enough people to roll out the ball just for the teams to get even started playing. Whereas, I'm an asshole, and it's why I don't leave my house as much. And I told you that when we were talking about setting up this podcast. I'm like, because I will say, hey, that Champagne Bar doesn't belong there. That mural doesn't belong there. Why does Stillwater's and Bella Brava now have 15 valet spots?
Right.
I mean, you can't even walk there. It's like growth issues.
But the thing you're talking about is all a specific tranche of issue, right?
Sure.
If I were to come to you and say, there is a grub worm that's on the south side that's around Lake Magori, and they're now using a new kind of mower, and it's killing all the grub worms, and we're not going to have a certain kind of moth. And I just really got passionate about, why don't you weigh in on that, right?
Yeah.
I guess my philosophy is I weigh on the things that I can do the most good with, and I leave the other things to people who are the most passionate
Well,
about
and I'm
them,
only
right?
bringing up Beach Drive because you have the website. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel this strongly about Ford Street.
My investment in Beach Drive is a larger investment in making people happier here because of their perspective on the city. It's not specifically to worry about the nuances of Beach Drive, right?
Right.
I leave that up to the business owners of Beach Drive. And so I say, I value that you have thought about it and researched it and are intelligent and have an opinion about it. And I want to give you a platform, if that's helpful, to put it out on. But I'm ignorant, right? I'm just ignorant. And so it's not a place for me to put my voice just for sake of putting my voice, because I don't know, right?
I get it. And this
Yeah.
has been incredibly informative on getting a better sense of what your larger goal is. In fact, with all of that you're doing for St. Pete, because eventually I'm going to come back to the St. Pete market in a way. Like, it'll probably be after, maybe another year, because you get the blogger you need or you deserve, not the one you want. And I think that, there is a lack. And that's, again, I can't say it enough. I'm so glad you guys are doing what you're doing, because there's a lack of public intellectualism in a way. It's very limited. There's limited forum, limited engagement. And then big issues pop up, like wouldn't the Catalyst have been an ideal spot for a year-long discussion about whether or not we put that public art on the piers space? That way, so
Certainly.
everybody could make their argument. But there really wasn't. It's like, it was so small and heated. It should have been a community-wide discussion.
And it's a nuance. I mean, I totally agree. And we would have been a good platform for that. And we are a community source news source. So every section of the Catalyst has an equivalent forum in the contribution center, right? With the exception of influencers. That's a nomination thing. But, we did a series called Agile Education. And so there's a series where it wasn't ignoring problems, but it was going around and, we're going to spend our resources on investigating something. We went and visited with PTech, and we went and looked at, the Suncoast Developers Guild and how they're building a new coding class, right? And these are the things that, if this information gets out and spread, these are the people that are educating, filling the jobs that our corporations need to succeed, and building the talent pool that we need to bring more businesses down here, which then solves a lot of the problems, right? So that's where we put our resources. We said we can help make people better about understanding the educational opportunities here, better about their mindset.
It's win-win.
It's win-win. Yeah. One of the companies, Nielsen, I think, or Jabil, like, they have a big policy now of just taking people with certain personality traits and bringing them in and training them into the roles that they need, because they know that if they have these tendencies and personality, they can make them. So instead of worrying about, building classes and places and that they can't really control, they're taking it into their own hands. So now other businesses have started to adopt that sort of mindset and said, okay, instead of complaining about how there's no talent down here, I will see how other companies are solving that problem, and I will go solve the problem that way. I'll hire this smart person and make them the employee that I need. But I would welcome you to come back. I think there's, as you know, with a magazine called Influencers, there's an art to influence. And, I think that taking some time away and getting a fresh perspective, I would look forward to you re-entering the space.
Yeah, it just goes back to what I was talking about. Just, I was writing about my neighbors.
Well, you choose what you write about, right?
Well, you choose what you write about. My wife loves a community up in Tallahassee. It's called Southwood, and it's where a lot of the influencers in the state political world live. And she's like, I could live here. And I'm like, no, we couldn't. We walk down the street and you would see the people that I had just written
Right.
700 critical words of. And so the same situation that we faced in St. Petersburg. Now, you said something like, why aren't we talking about our I wish people kind of would stop talking about, we have this potential. And two things came to mind when you said that. Number one, I don't think that there is a good sense of the history of how we got to where we are at right now. Like, I've had a debate with a lot of people that you would probably know. I'm like, how many renaissances have we had?
Mm-hmm.
Is it one long boom? Like, I think the most important decision that was made was the reopening of the Vinoy. It's not because I love the Vinoy, which I do, but with that, you started to transform just the basic footprint around Beach Drive, which would then, transform other things. Some people say the decision in '86 to, start building the stadium may have been the consequential. I would make the argument, that it really began basically 90, 91 and into Rick Baker's first term, that began the boom. You got St. Pete College where it's at in downtown St. Pete. You've got the Palladium where it was, and you got American Stage where it is. And people don't realize that used to be all reversed. And none of it was working. The stage was at where the Palladium was, and St. Pete College wasn't where it was. And he got together with a guy, Carl Cutler, who was the president of St. Pete College, got him to basically build a footprint down there so that they could put American Stage there.
Mhm.
And he did this kind of like crazy three-way trade that would have made an NBA GM envious. And like I always tell people, like, where's the best place for the stadium right now? And they're like, it's the dog track. It really is. When you think about it, if we had to start over, we would probably put it in either Toy Town or the dog track because it would be able to get the Pinellas funding mechanism,
Right.
but it would still be close to St. Pete, and you've got the huge transportation areas for it. That's like three-dimensional chess there.
Yep.
And so I don't know that a lot of the new people in town that are making a lot of good noise. And I guess that's, I don't know, it's like saying that rocks weighed more back when I was a kid. I enjoy, and it's why I would want to be back involved, is connecting some of the history.
Yep.
I used to be involved more with St. Pete preservation. And I like what Peter Belmont and Kai did with the walking tours so that you knew how that building got to be where it is. And you have to know this stuff, like Sundial is such a complicated story because it was Baywalk before that. How is Sundial working and Baywalk collapsed, right? That's like a genuine question. And you realize that they had security issues and there were, micro riots and things like that down there. And so whoever, somebody's eventually going to buy that from whoever owns it now or whatever, from Bill Edwards or whatever the convoluted thing is. When those people come into town, will they even know what Baywalk was? Or will they just look at it as this successful real estate development now? And so they're like, you know what? Why do we have 6 security guards here? And will there be somebody to say, well, we have 6 security guards here because I remember one of the first things that I did when I got back from living in Tallahassee my last time. It was on the night before my birthday. I went and participated in a Israeli Gaza. It was during the second Intifada. There was a 200, 300 person Israel versus Palestine protest right under Dan Marino's. No wonder nobody went down there, right? And I wonder, the next people that come in, will they even know? Right now, when we're talking about the stadium, on the stadium deal, as people are talking about it, I was basically for a little bit the campaign manager for the group POW. People opposed to, we were keeping the Ray Stadium from moving down to Alling. Well, why did that happen? And I think so much of that history informs what the Rays are doing now. And so I just think that one of the big challenges, and it's something I almost challenge with the Catalyst, because I don't think it's necessarily a negative, and I don't even think it's opinionated, but connecting the dots, look at 400 Beach Drive, that building. Did people know what that was? That was a 2-story building before that? That Robert Irvine, the big chef, and I think that there's a lot of missing history.
Sure, totally. We're making an effort. We built St. Petersburg Pier.com, and we paid actually Monica Kyle, who used to run the Preservation
I love
Society.
Monica.
She wrote a history for us, 10 pages
Oh, did she?
on all the piers on St. Petersburg Pier.com. And we had Peter Betzer in last week, and he gave us a full history of the downtown partnership and how they bought the land to, get USF St. Pete on there, and talked about a lot of these same movers and shakers.
And I'm not putting it
Sure.
on you.
So
I
I
wish more
agree.
people
So I
looked at
agree.
your site for it.
But then, the follow-on point to that is the age-old question. It's an ROI, right? So
Yeah.
yes, that information has value, but to collect, produce, chronicle, promote, and get that information out there, there's a lot to that. And I'm interested in it for sure. And my goal is what lessons can we learn from it? And the more lessons you can extract from it, the bigger the ROI on taking the time to find that, right? So, St. Pete 2.0 has an element of history to it. So we understand where we're coming from. It also has an element of where we're going. And so that's the age-old question. Is I think the challenge as archivists or as distillers of our history, we have to be able to bring enough current day lessons, enough anecdotal entertainment or whatever to make it worth finding that out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was challenged, because I hear things like that I would love to dig into. And it's just, right now I have a 4-person staff, and, I want to go to 6, and it's always resources.
I got people that pitch me, why don't you do a site that focuses on Lake County politics? And I'm like, all right, good. Do you want to give us $14,000 for 3 reporters? And they're, we have the largest political reporting footprint in the state.
Mm-hmm.
Something like, I would say we have month to month, I probably dole out 25 individual checks.
Right.
Some people full-time. I don't think people understand when it comes to building one of these sites. It's all labor. This isn't like you're buying widgets. It's like, if you don't get in some income for it, you cannot pay the writer. I always say it like literally at the end of the day, I'm an ad salesman,
mm-hmm.
and I'm collecting checks. And I'm like, hey, you're late on your check. And the reason why that matters is because I'm going to be late paying Jim Rossica, my reporter in Tallahassee. It's not like I'm not going to pay for fuel that month or whatever. I'm not going to pay someone's salary. And so that's, I think, the biggest challenge. And that the Times goes through that. I think 70 or 80% of their budget is human.
Just because I'm at a similar where you were a while ago with regard to building the publishing out, Can you tell me a little bit about speaking of history, and obviously you did the St. Peter's blog yourself for a while. Then how did you start adding, who were your first kind of staff people,
Sure.
and how did that grow?
Having a kid changes everything, right? And so you want to start to delegate. So in 2012, 2013, I needed to start bringing some people on. And I didn't think any reporters would want to join on. And I didn't have the budget for it either. So I went on Facebook. I said, hey, I need some political writers.
Uh-huh.
And I think the formula was if you'd write me 25 blog posts, I'd pay you $1,600.
25 less. So how many were about 400 words or
Yeah.
600 words?
And that would always be they're like, well, how many words? And I would say,
Whatever you want.
2 words.
Okay.
If it's an incredible story and you can tell it in 6 words, I don't care. If it takes 1,200 words, that's on you. And so I brought in, I believe Karen Cyphers was the first person that I brought in. She's got a PhD, a brilliant, brilliant woman. She's now at Sachs Media Group, which is in Tallahassee, one of the state's biggest public relations firms. She does kind of their data analytics operation. And she was just really good at finding interesting nuggets. And this is before, like the way like Google will send out a press release about Google Trends and this is what's trending and stuff like that. She was finding that stuff out 6 years
Human
ago.
version of that.
Yeah, she was a human. And so she was constant. In fact, we put out an email called Last Call. It's a 7 o'clock, like kind of recap on the day. Each day it includes an original, kind of like the way USA Today had its little snapshot artwork. We do something like that about something going on in Florida or interesting stat that always comes from Karen. And then the second person I hired, and he's still with us, is Phil Ammon, who was just basically a brand writer. And he's doubled his salary from starting up basically getting together, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. He's my right hand. And it's his birthday actually today, but he keeps the trains running on time. And we have a lot of trains.
Mhm.
We put out the morning email, the evening email. We write 25 or 30 stories a day. We have a weekend email. He organizes the staff, et cetera. So he has probably our most important job. Mitch Perry was the first real journalist that we hired. Mitch and I knew each other from doing this kind of stuff, radio shows and TV shows together. I kind of believe that what we are doing, what you're doing, is basically what alt newspapers were doing
Mhm.
20 years ago. And so it was kind of natural for Mitch to leave Creative Loafing, especially Creative Loafing was having some tough times and he jumped over to us. And then from there, we just kept adding. And it's been, I think, I liken myself to the Tampa Bay Rays in that we constantly feed to the bigger programs. And so, like, 2 reporters that I kind of picked up, they did a year with us and then they went to Politico. Our last reporter, Anna Sabalos, she just went to the USA Today network. We hired Gary Shelton away from the Tampa Bay Times, which, he was the big sports reporter in town. And so we were able to attract natural journalists. We had Scott Powers in Orlando. He was the leading political reporter in Orlando. It probably still is. And we do it with a different budgeting. Our folks run through walls. We've gone through a lot of people because it's like turning around an aircraft carrier with some of these veteran journalists.
Mhm.
They're like, hey, I wrote my 600 words today. I'm like, I needed that by 10. And we've had issues with that. Now my kind of formula is like the Rays in a lot of ways, getting them very young. And so he was just going to the Tallahassee Democrat, but he had been the editor of the FSU newspaper. And another one that was at the Alligator and was going to go to the Gainesville Sun, and he's with us. And so maybe getting them in a little bit younger and kind of not having to unteach some bad habits.
Other than the obvious good writer, diligent, tenacious, or whatever, are there any qualities that you look for, you think, that are specific to you when you're looking at these young writers?
With us, you have to know politics. And that sounds obvious, but a lot of people go out as general assignment folks and they think that they can lend themselves to politics. We are a political website for political insiders. So you have to know your stuff. You have to be kind of an expert in the subject matter. Speed is an important quality. I think I like to use another baseball metaphor. I look for 5-tool players, that they can do social media, that they can write for speed, that they can scoop, and that they write clean. And it's a challenge when you find one of those folks and you kind of cycle through a lot of folks to get to that. It is a buyer's market. There's certainly more unemployed journalists and writers out there than there are jobs in the industry. We have the advantage. I always go back to, and it sounds obvious, but it isn't. I look for smart, I look for savvy, and we can teach you all of the rest. But it goes back to our education. So I would rather have somebody has a liberal arts degree and has 15 or 20 different inspirations than just a standard J school graduate that's trained in the art of journalism, but isn't inspired in the same, I like people with hobbies. That's a big thing. Like, especially as you go through and you look at people's Facebook pages, I think people are really who they are on social media. Yes, we are all our better selves, but you can get to the core. And I will tell you, and I think it was one of my mentors who told me, really look for their hobbies. Not that they have to be particularly good at them, but if they have interesting hobbies, it's one of the quickest things to notice.
So financially, you have the staff that you're paying. I know that you have a couple streams of income. You have your advertising through your publications or your websites, and then you also do some consulting as well.
Mhm.
Talk about if you could go back, I'm mostly curious, obviously, if you could go back 10 years, would you have built in a different way? Or do you think if you put more into the publication side of it, that would be, I can imagine how you could put more into, you put a lot into it, but
I wish I had done it cleaner. I wish I had not got into the headbutting with the times.
do you have too many outlets? Do you wish you would have streamlined into one brand, or
Well,
are your
you
brands
know,
all different puzzle pieces?
just as we're talking about our history, remember our lives changed when we bought the domain floridapolitics.com. Like, that just became so important to us. I mean, we paid an enormous price for it. And we literally, a guy was going to sell it off of eBay. And I said, no, you're not. And I had an emergency meeting of my investors so I could get what I thought, I thought it was going to take 50,000. It didn't take 50, but it was a lot of money. I went into my wife and I said, if we had to do it all over, because St. Peter's blog is such an awkward name and it limited us in so many ways. I said, if we had any domain name, she's like, well, if we could have gotten Florida Politics, that would have been awesome, but that'll never be available. I'm like, well, I need to borrow the credit card because it is. But I couldn't change that at this point. But I would say I had such a rough time at it at the beginning, a lot of it on my part, because, a lot of new media, especially in the political sphere, is punching at the established folks. And you get limited out on things. And I wish I had been cleaner about the conflict of interests that I had between being a consultant and publishing. Like, now it doesn't matter. Now, in a way, I'm bigger than having to worry about those things. And I've got reporters so they can just do the straight news story. But when it was me, when I would write a story on Jeff Brandis, well, I was also working for his campaign. So of course you're getting the scoop. I mean, and so I wish I could do all of that cleaner, because I do feel like there will always be a residual bad will in the Florida journalism and the Florida political journalism sphere to how I entered the market. Now, I've got a lot of supporters out there who specifically came to us because we were the alternative to what they viewed as either bad or
don't say
biased.
Don't say it.
What?
Fake news.
Or fake. In a way, I always, this is a terrible joke, but I'm like, we were the Russians before the Russians did what they did. That's what we did. We got involved in, we write a story and we jack it up on Facebook. Like, to me, it's so ridiculous. Isn't that always the way with 70-year-old white male politicians, where they're just like, well, the Facebook really got us into trouble. And I'm like, we've been doing this since like 2010. Like, how are you just discovering the idea of getting people to argue with each other on Facebook? And so overall, if I have a great regret when it comes to the publishing part, it would be I would have liked to have done it a lot cleaner.
This has been great. I've been looking forward to sitting down with you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And so we end every show with a shout out. And this is a chance to specifically, I think, someone who doesn't get the love they deserve, that that's doing great stuff in St. Pete and that you want to shine a positive light on.
Is it only one, or can I rapid fire, like just a stream of consciousness?
I'm all for the rapid fire. Go for it.
I really like what Ryan Griffin, and I've not always gotten along with Ryan. We used to play basketball kind of hard nosed against each other. Love what he's doing with Trophy Fish down there. I think that's a great addition to the restaurant scene.
He's also one of the main players in Grow Smarter as well. He's the kind of the chair of the whole operation.
He's doing a lot of good stuff. I increasingly like what the Downtown Partnership is doing relative to what I thought the chamber should be doing. I think there's a lot of smart thought coming out of the chamber. I give credit to Steve Cornell. You start to take some of these council members for granted after a while. He's been making the right votes now for a while. I know one big issue right now that's going to be big in St. Pete is the massive increase in water rates. And it's because of all the water issues that the city has had. And he's tried to hold the line. And I see him, he pops onto people's Facebook pages, and not in a negative way, but really talks to them about the issues. I want to give a shout out to the 4 city council members. I think it was Ed Montanari, Cornell, I think Darden, I don't remember, maybe Foster, who did vote against the public art at the pier. Not because I was against the public art, but I think that they're holding the line, as so many people do want to rush in to make St. Pete even better and that we need to have more conversation about what we're doing. It's very easy, but there are some great city council candidates, not even people that I'm working with or anything like that. But I think, if anybody's listening, they really should pay attention to the Tampa City Council races because they are going to define not just the future of Tampa, but really the future of the region. Tampa is reasserting itself as kind of the centerpiece of the region. 8 years ago, it was obvious who the city council people were going to be. There are no more Bob Buckhorns or Dick Greccos in Tampa politics. It really will be a new generation of leaders. And it's so interesting what's happening in Tampa in terms of the number of projects that they have going on right now. I think that that's something. And finally, it was just Bastille Day. Let's give a shout out to our friends at Cassis, Chef Jeremy, and I can't think of everybody. Philippe, who's the owner there. I know that some of the people that own Kawa and Trist are a part of that second, but it's really cool that they've added that. If we can get another round of restaurants off of, if there's Beach Drive and then there's Broadway and then off Broadway, if we can get off Broadway finally built out, it'll be really nice.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You made it to the end of another great episode. For show notes, head to stpete.co to the show notes page, which includes links to all the resources mentioned in the show, as well as quotes and key insights from the show and information about the guest and the host. Thanks again to our sponsor, Big C. Head to Big C, that's BIGSEA.co to check out their work. And if you like what you heard, make sure to share this episode on social media and leave a comment. See you next time.